Hello, hello, world history students, my world history people. We are back talking about the end of World War II. This is guided notes 14.2, talking about the end of the war, right? So let's go ahead and start that. These are the last years of the war. So as you see here, beginning in 1943, the tide of the battle is turning, especially for the Allied powers in the European theater, especially in areas in Italy, right? The Axis forces, especially Italy, surrendered in Tunisia, that's in Africa, in 1943. Sorry. The Allies were able to take that and make their way to Italy, because Italy, according to Winston Churchill, was known as the soft underbelly of the Axis powers. That means that Italy at this point was the weakest and most vulnerable area for the Axis powers, and the Allies used that as their advantage to attack. So when they did, they were able to take Italy down, and now Italy is now a part of the Allied forces once they have Mussolini has surrendered. Okay. Now in the European theater, D-Day is one of the most famous battles, right? Because this is actually where, in the European theater, the war ends. So on the western half, or the western side, World War II ends on that side because of D-Day. This is when Allied forces rush onto the beaches of Normandy, France, and now they push the German forces back to Germany, and now Germany is forced to fight not only on their western front but also from their eastern front from Soviet Union. So now they're not able to handle fighting both sides, and now because of that, Germany is able to surrender, or has to surrender, and that's the end of World War II on the western side, right? And this is a picture of what D-Day looked like, or the Battle of Normandy. And as you see, there's tons of battleships here that swarm in to land on the beaches of Normandy, France. So here's a big rundown of the European theater and the end of World War II. In the European theater, pay attention to the dates as you're writing this down in your guided notes. As you see here, by 1945, the German army in Italy surrendered, and by April 30th, 1945, and this is a photo of, or picture of this headline, as you see there, big in bold letters, Hitler dead, he commits suicide. Right, and by May 8th, 1945, in England, this is Churchill right here, they are celebrating because that is the day of victory in Europe. So tons of people are out in the streets celebrating the end of World War II in Europe. However, the battle still forges on in the Asian theater. This is between the United States and Japan. Japan is relentless. However, the US forces are still doing this attack mode of island hopping, going from one island to another, right, to try to get as close to Japan as possible. They were able to gain 2 victories and acquire 2 islands, 2 Japanese islands, one of Iwo Jima and the other of Okinawa, and that helped them to gain momentum, the United States, to gain as close to the Japanese islands as possible. So now they're inching closer to Japan. This is one of those photos that is very, very famous, showing the soldiers placing that flag in the ground. I think this was in Iwo Jima, if I'm not mistaken. And now it's an actual statue or monument today. Manhattan Project. So even though the Allies, or United States, was quite successful with both battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, it came at a cost because many soldiers, many military died. And this was one of the bloodiest battles, or the bloodiest wars ever in history, right? Um, President Franklin D. Roosevelt died in office, and now Harry S. Truman is the new president after Roosevelt died. And Truman now has to make this decision because his cabinet mentioned that he should not, or advised him not to invade Japan because it's going to cost a lot of casualties, somewhere in the millions, right? However, scientists were working on this top secret project called the Manhattan Project, and they were developing something called the atomic bomb. And his advisors were convinced that if they used this bomb rather than sending American troops in to invade Japan, that the casualties will be much less than, going straight in with Japan by using the bomb. So Truman had this really difficult task, or this really difficult decision to make. Should he go ahead and invade Japan with American troops or Allied forces, or should he use this atomic bomb? Well, he did use the atomic bomb, and there were not one, but there were 2 atomic bombs, and nobody really knew, as you see here, how effective those bombs would be. Quite effective, actually, to a fault. Maybe we can even say too effective. As you see here, Hiroshima was the first bomb that was dropped in August 6, 1945. On impact, 80,000 people died. Nagasaki came 3 days later. 40,000 people died on impact. Hundreds of thousands of people died on the after effects from the radiation of the mushroom cloud, as you see here. This is an actual photo of what that bomb looks like. And many people suffered after the effect, years later, because of radiation exposure, cancers, etc. However, because of those 2 events with the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Japanese did come to an unconditional surrender, because that's what the United States was looking for. Allied forces were looking for an unconditional surrender, meaning that they had no qualms, no stipulations, no conditions or anything like that. It was just pure surrender, period, right? Eventually, because of these 2 bombings and how devastating, because nobody knew how devastating it was going to be, and then seeing the effects of it, it was completely devastating. Japan surrenders September 2nd, 1945. August 14th, 1945, Japan surrenders, and then September 2nd, 1945 is known as VJ Day, which is Victory Over Japan, or Japan Day. Where they sign their surrender documents. So Japan suffers greatly from these 2 atomic bombs, right? And here, as you see, this is the amount of devastation that happened from these atomic bombs. Women, men, and civilian children were heavily affected. The area was heavily affected, as you see here. The waters, the air, full of radioactive activity, or radioactive fallout. So that's gonna last for years. It takes years for those things to clear, because it's pure atomic energy, right? So after the war, there's efforts to try to make some form of peace between everyone, to try to really settle things and, not get into a World War III, right? So the Tehran Conference happened between Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill. So this happened before Roosevelt died, right? And they met to discuss their strategies, try to figure out how they were going to end things with Germany. And the Allies agreed to make a split of Germany after the war on a north-south, partition, meaning that they're going to split Germany in half, right? So that Stalin or the Soviets have their part, and then the Allied, or Great Britain, United States, and France would have their part. In the Yalta Conference in 1945, As you see here, Stalin wanted this buffer zone. As you see here, would be this kind of buffer zone between the Allied forces and the Soviets, because Stalin was really concerned about the West, right? The Allies pushing democracy on his area or his occupied area. So he wanted to have part of Poland as this buffer zone, right? As you see here. However, Roosevelt and many of the Allied forces wanted those groups, like as you see here, Poland and some other areas that was once occupied by Germany, they wanted them to determine their own way of governing. So that's going to create problems, and we'll get into that later. The United Nations, out of this was created. The United Nations was similar to the League of Nations that we talked about from World War I, right? But this time it worked. United Nations still exists today, and it's meant to prevent war as much as possible from any country, right? So they try to come up with strategies, talks, what have you, to make sure that, you know, countries are avoiding war as much as possible. And as you see here, as a result of this conference, Germany was split up into 4 zones. You had the Soviet zone, American, the British, and the French zone. And then Poland was offered free elections so that they can determine their own government. All right, in the Potsdam Conference, Truman demanded a free election in those Eastern European countries that were once German occupied, but Stalin did not. He wanted them under the control of his regime or his country as a communist satellite state, meaning that they are controlled by the Soviet Union, but still has some autonomy in terms of their government, somewhat. Now, this would actually show, in this Potsdam Conference, would actually show this tension between the United States and the Soviet Union in terms of they're disagreeing with communist aggression and democracy aggression both at the same time. So it shows that tension between both that is going to lead us into what is called the Cold War. However, all these countries did agree that there should be trials against the leaders of those leaders that created crimes against humanity. And this is where that term came in, especially during this time, crimes against humanity from the Nazi Party, and also those that happened in Japan as well with Tojo, Heideke Tojo, the Batam Death March, etc. All of those things that happened to the POWs, etc. And those trials were called the Nuremberg trials. A lot of the Nazis party officials, you know, your SS, many of them were put on trial and sent to jail, or many of them were even executed. Okay, so so as I mentioned, as the war slowly just faded into the past, still remnants of it was still there, right? So again, that tension between the United States and the Soviet Union, and both sides wanting to push their political agenda of, you know, the Soviets thought that communists, you know, should be in their area, but the United States thought that they were going to push their communist agenda worldwide, right? And it was the same thing on the other side. The Soviets viewed United States and their policy pushing this global capitalist democratic expansion, especially the capitalist part of it, meaning we went over capitalism before and what capitalism is in terms of free enterprise and having people having their own businesses, that kind of thing. And, you know, the Soviets Communist Party, you know, they were fearful of having that ideology in their sphere of the world. And they didn't, either side did not want that type of influence, and they were really fearful that that influence was coming to their shores. So now there's this tension, political tension between both superpowers, and it's going to come at a head really fast and almost to a point where it can be potentially deadly. And we'll talk more about that in the next unit when we talk about the Cold War. So here's your apply it. You're going to use this chart to answer some questions in your guided notes or in Edpuzzle as well. And I will see you in the next unit.